So welcome to LitFest. This is our first LitFest event for 2021, and it's our first virtual LitFest ever, so be patient with us here. And I'll be letting more people in as they come in. So I will introduce Dr. Steve Bellamy. He's a professor, assistant professor at Clark University. He's been teaching for over 10 years, and I'm really excited to have him do this presentation today. This is a fun topic. So I'll let him take over.
Great. Thanks, Larissa. And I just want to, okay, so let me just share my screen here. So right now, Larissa, just really quickly before we get started, right now you sort of can see like the Microsoft PowerPoint stuff with the notes and what have you, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to keep it that way just for 2 slides. Just so that I can read from my script a little bit, and then once I get through that, then I'll turn it to the full screen so you don't see all this other stuff. Okay. First, hello and welcome to The Game is Afoot, the meaning and practice of detective fiction. Like Larissa said, my name is Steve Bellamy, and I'm an assistant professor of English at Clark University, which is in Dubuque, Iowa. I'd like to thank the Galena Public Library District for this opportunity to spend a couple of hours with you all today discussing such a fascinating and really kind of complex genre of literature. Just a few quick remarks at the beginning here regarding how the workshop is organized. The presentation portions of the workshop are going to be in 2 parts. First, I want to provide a historical cultural overview that provides us some general context. I suspect this will take about 40 minutes or so. And then I want to open it up to discussion, and we can discuss for as long as you'd like before we turn to looking at just a few different types or kinds of detectives and some passages that I think sort of highlight those types. And then I think what we can do is finish with a broad discussion of the appeal of detective fiction for readers and for writers alike. I suspect we have a diverse audience today that might include students, fiction writers, teachers, scholars, and attendees interested to varying degrees in detective fiction. And during our discussions, I hope we hear all kinds of perspectives. I wouldn't call myself an expert in the field, but I do teach the class. And if there's one thing I know about fans of detective fiction is that they read a lot of detective fiction. So I'm hoping to come away with lots of new titles, ideas that I can add to my own list of things to read and think about. So with that, I can go ahead and open this here. Okay. So the outline of the presentation is thus. Just 3 questions. What conditions prompted the rise of the detective as a popular literary figure? What is a detective? And talking a little bit about the kinds of detectives that we see in the 19th and 20th centuries and into the 21st. And lastly, how that genre appeals to us. What is it doing for us as writers and readers? And then I'll have a few closing thoughts. So, what is detective fiction? There are a number of forms in the same constellation with detective fiction. Crime fiction, murder mysteries, gaslight crimes that involve sort of theft, police procedurals, which we'll talk about later, so on and so forth. But I thought what we could focus on today is how detective fiction emphasizes character and how it puts 2 forces into something of a dialogue. The detective on one side and the mystery on the other. And that space between we can call the investigation, right? That's the process that sort of elongates the confrontation between detective and mystery or crime. Detectives were usually, at least early on, men, although there are early somewhat early instances of women detectives. This is W.S. Hayward's it's a detail from Revelations of a Lady Detective. And also children play a role as detectives as well. One of my daughter's favorite shows is The Investigators, which is an Australian TV show for kids where they have a detective agency. So Boy Detective was a series of, I believe, something over 70, serialized in over 70 episodes or issues. And that was from 1866. But detective fiction usually includes, this is quoting from Charles Jebka's really sort of useful introduction to the genre, a detective of some kind, an unsolved mystery, although not always technically a crime, and an investigation by which the mystery is solved. There is often what many call a puzzle element to detective fiction as well. And what the puzzle element does in terms of that investigation is drive the plot forward, but also activate in us as readers our own use of reason as we try to solve the mystery. And those three elements begin Charles Jebka's discussion of detective fiction, and they're sort of deceptively simple. It's actually quite a complex process that's happening in that sort of triangle of the detective, the mystery, and the investigation. What I thought we could do is, by way of introduction into this kind of action of discovering or detecting, is kind of take a different sort of angle on it and look at a particularly infamous moment in English criminal history that, you know, maybe sets some of the parameters for our discussion. This is a detail from Samuel Ward's woodcut from 1621, Double Deliverance. And it highlights for us the deliverance or the discovery of the 1605 gunpowder plot. For those of you who know your early English history, 1605, a band of Catholic conspirators disgruntled with James I's treatment of Catholics in Protestant England, devise a plot to blow up Parliament, assassinate King James and members of on November 5th, 1605. The legend has it that Guy Fawkes, who was from York in England, but was a Spanish sympathizer and a munitions master for the Armada, was recruited into the plot because of his knowledge of gunpowder. As such, he sort of becomes the trigger man and really the kind of boogeyman of the plot over the course of history. This is a very early representation, if you will, and there's just a couple things I wanted to point out here of interest. So here's Guy Fawkes, and I think you can see my cursor here. So here's Guy Fawkes. Here are those barrels of gunpowder, Parliament as it looked in 1605. The kind of classic lantern, right? And what we have up here is the all-seeing eye of Providence, the eye of God, if you will. And fortunately, this Latin here, video radio, is translated to I see and smile. And that's kind of smiling in a sort of mocking way, the sort of Protestant, you know, God sort of mocking the Catholics for their attempt at you know, blowing up Parliament. And this is an instance of merciful deliverance in the early modern period. And there's something sort of, I don't know, detective-y about the whole thing. God's eyeball up here in the clouds, and the sort of beam of light, almost a sort of inverted flashlight beam, if you will, where the source of light is high and then shines light into the discovery of Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes doesn't go away, still hasn't. This is a painting some 200 years later of from Henry Paranet Briggs's The Discovery of the Gunpowder Plot and the Taking of Guy Fawkes. This showcases quite a difference, I think, in terms of who's doing the detecting, the discovering, right? And the role of the criminal figure. I mean, right off the bat, Fawkes is looking sort of, at, not quite at us, but is facing us and is sort of cast in shadow, but illuminated in the face, and sort of all the more dashing for it, right? Has a certain kind of criminality to him, a sort of attractiveness, if you will, in that sort of darkness, where the Kingsmen are highlighted clearly in light. Are the Kingsmen agents of providential discovery in this instance? Yeah, probably, but there is no providential eye looking down anymore. That providential eye really speaks to the sort of, if you will, the sort of supernatural or the pre-rational idea of something intervening and discovering on behalf of Protestants, okay? So 200 years later, same event, but very different orientation, very different emphasis, okay? And then lastly, by the end of the 19th century, in 1896, the English were able to have some fun with the figure of Guy Fawkes. And this is from a sort of comic history from the end of the 19th century. But it's particularly important, I think, for our purposes, because we have the introduction of a police officer doing the discovering. And that to me is just sort of fascinating, how we've gone from providential sort of deliverance to the sort of advent of the police officer earlier in the 19th century, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but that actually sort of becomes part of the equation, the Bobby here. And of course, Fawkes now has lost much of his sort of attractive, mysterious appeal and looks almost a sort of drunkard in some ways. So interesting to see that. So all three of these images, though, really confront the sort of discovering or the detecting force with the mystery or the crime or the criminal, right? And they're sort of conflated. And that's something that literature is able to do differently, say, than painting, because you can't really paint an investigation. The space between a figure, say, like this, and Fawkes, and how this person finally arrives at this person, in detective fiction needs to be sort of elongated, right? But I do think that these three images showcase a change in emphasis over the years, as this in this particular case, which I think is interesting. But literary genres don't sort of come out of nowhere, right? And one of the things that to ask the first question on the workshop description is, what conditions prompted the eventual rise of the detective as a literary figure? Again, these genres don't just sort of appear. Detectives don't just sort of happen all of a sudden. There are things, and for those of you who read about genres and read about sort of literary history, you know that, lots of things go into the pot in terms of the emergence of a genre and the development of it over time. So the three things that I've distilled, and I will sort of admit that I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants in some way in relying on certain works by people like Michael Sims or Charles Jebka, who I referenced, or John Skaggs, someone else. But what I've distilled from what I've read and how I introduce the genre when I teach the class are these three sort of developments. The first one is the rise of Enlightenment thought from the realm of science. The second is the literary development of the Gothic from the realm of literary arts. And the third is the emergence of the private investigator and the creation of the police force, sort of from the realm of public institutions. If you're a fan of detective fiction, you know that there are lots of other conditions sort of in the mix here, but I think these three might frame our presentation nicely for today. So talking a little bit about Enlightenment thought, in, you know, the Enlightenment in 3 minutes version. 1690 to 1790, none of this is in a vacuum, but give or take, that's a nice 100-year sort of time period to think a little bit about Enlightenment thought. And what the Enlightenment calls for, and this is from Margaret Jacobs's useful introduction, it calls for new thinking about once unquestioned truths and eventually for new actions based on that new thinking. So that new thinking is going to try and push against superstition, folklore, things like that. And the key metaphor for the Enlightenment is, you guessed it, light. Right? That the light is something that reveals laws, systems, relationships between things through inquiry, through observation and experiment. During this time, the Bible becomes less a sort of official document of historical knowledge and is replaced by empirical observation, experimentation, skepticism, and observation. This involves reason, rationality, right? And like I said, empirical observation. And it does speak to Newton's mathematical formulas that explain the universe's dependence on knowable laws. And you've probably heard about, you know, John Locke's work on governmental philosophy and education. But it also involves things like the rise of newspapers and coffee houses and public debate. It's always fun to talk to my students about the first coffee house in London was established in 1651. And by the middle of the 18th century, there were over 500 of them in London alone. So the coffee shop or the coffee house at the time really was that space where, you know, men could debate, could reason, could think, could argue, could use their rational thinking to discuss the news, right? The news from afar, from abroad, so on and so forth. And it's always, I like to teach a short novella called Phantomina, or Love in a Maze is its subtitle. And, you know, one of the great things about that novella is that Phantomina, who's unnamed, but she's known as Phantomina, it starts and she's curious, right? Curiosity is really the thing that sort of drives the engine of that novella, is that idea of curiosity, right? So I think the era is interesting for this kind of newfound interest in observation and experimentation and curiosity. At the same time, we get the rise of a particular literary genre, which is the Gothic. And while I say here, while science may need the light, literature needs that darkness, right? It needs that sort of mystery and that intrigue to it. Some say that Horace Walpole sort of, in one fell swoop, created the Gothic novel in 1764 with his novel, The Castle of Otranto. It's a wacky book. If you've never read it, you can, it's okay, but it's kind of wild. What The Castle of Otranto does is it introduces a style of fiction that includes medieval castles, damsels in distress, secret chambers, hallways, wind is always blowing throughout the sort of castle chambers. The supernatural is there in the form of ghosts, etc. And related to that, and probably most importantly for our purposes when we're thinking about detective fiction, is the theme of the past as that thing that haunts the present. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I did want to just point out that the Gothic did become such a sensation that I chose the title page from the second edition of the Castle of Otranto, because that was the edition that Walpole decided to actually use the word Gothic. When the novel was first published, it just read The Castle of Otranto, a story, but because of the sensation around it, and this particular word just sort of driving more sort of curiosity and interest, this in the second edition is when he actually used the word Gothic to describe his story, which is, I don't know, just kind of interesting. And if you don't want to read Gothic literature from the middle of the 18th century, I would encourage you to just watch Guillermo del Toro's 2015 movie, Crimson Peak. And this is just a quick little aside. And just remember that if you need a sort of refresher on what the Gothic is, just kind of watch this movie and just think to yourself, every single thing I'm seeing in this movie is Gothic, okay? It has all the pieces of the Gothic that you need. And I just thought I'd throw that in there just because I just saw that movie and I couldn't help thinking about how Gothic this film was. So how does this show up then in, fiction of mysteries and detection? I've got two examples here. The first is in reference to Vera Claythorne, who is a character in Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. And then the second one is a short passage from The Cuckoo's Calling. And I thought maybe we could, read through these passages here and talk a little bit about them. So the idea of the past coming back to haunt the present. Cyril's head bobbing up and down, swimming to the rock, up and down, and herself swimming in easy practice strokes after him, cleaving her way through the water, but knowing only too surely that she wouldn't be in time. And Vera, as a character in that novel, is perpetually haunted by this event from her time as a governess. And without sort of giving away too much of it, just to say that this boy Cyril drowns, and this event sort of constantly creeps back into Vera Claythorne's mind. I particularly like the up and down, right? The repetition that Christie gives, that this sense almost that this is not just Cyril's head sort of bobbing up and down, but actually the past itself, right? Sort of coming back and haunting, and then going, and then coming back and haunting, up and down. We see this rise up of the past all the time in detective fiction and detective film. Here's another instance from Robert Galbraith, who of course we all know is J.K. Rowling's pen name, or the pen name for J.K. Rowling in her detective series. He had hoped to spot the flickering shadow of a murderer as he turned the file's pages, but instead it was the ghost of Lula herself who emerged, gazing up at him as victims of violent crime sometimes did through the detritus of their interrupted lives. And this is a moment where Cormoran Strike is sort of looking through the file of Lula Landry, who is the celebrity murdered at the beginning of that novel. Gothic settings could also extend to cityscapes. These are two illustrations from a 1930s edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And we see that London, the streets of London in this particular illustration, almost look kind of castle-esque, right? Full of shadows and sort of dark corridors and sort of unknown doorways into who knows what, right? The darkness of the scene is really part of the detective tradition. And what does man find, or what do our characters find when they, go into those depths? Well, evil, right? Jekyll and Hyde is very much a story about a sort of dual nature of man, right? The dual nature of man as sort of good and evil. And in Stevenson's case, right, that they're sort of embodied into a singular, but I think as we move forward into detective fiction, I think we can see how that, continues to play out through detectives who sort of maybe flirt a little too closely with the dark side, if you will, and get a little too wrapped up in their cases. So, Jekyll and Hyde plays a big role, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about Robert McIlvaney's Laidlaw series in a little bit, but there's very much a sort of that sort of duality of human nature going on in so much detective fiction. And I think a lot of this stems from the Gothic. The third instance, or the third cultural sort of condition, if you will, that brings to rise detective fiction is the private investigator and the police force. And I'm going to rely on Michael Sims here, whose introduction to the Penguin book of Victorian women in crime has a nice section in it about, the sort of trajectory of all of this. And it differs obviously from country to country, but we'll focus on England, where the original sort of model were thief takers, which were sort of like, I guess you could call them like wannabe bounty hunters, if you will. They were typically sort of, sketchy sort of characters, but who were hired by people who could afford them to capture criminals. The trajectory then sort of extends to 1749 with Henry Fielding's development of what were called the Bow Street Runners, who were, I guess, a little bit more of an official sort of force that would go out and deliver subpoenas, capture criminals, travel in order to do so. And then it wasn't until 1829 then that Parliament passed the Metropolitan Police Act, which replaced this kind of what Michael Sims calls this antique plexus, if you will, of watchmen and parish constables with a reasonably organized force. And that, in England anyway, becomes the sort of first official police department. Dorothy Sayers this is a long passage, but that's okay. Dorothy Sayers sums all of this up, I think, pretty nicely in her introduction to the Omnibus of Crime. And this is a great introduction. There's a PDF available online. And if you've never read it, gosh, just so much interesting information in that introduction. But she writes, in the 19th century, the vast, unexplored limits of the world began to shrink at an amazing and unprecedented rate. The electric telegraph circled the globe. Railways brought remote villages into touch with civilization. Photographs made known to the stay-at-homes the marvels of foreign landscapes, customs, and animals. Science reduced seeming miracles to mechanical marvels. Popular education and improved policing made town and country safer for the common man than they had ever been. In place of the adventurer and the knight-errant, popular imagination hailed the doctor, the scientist, and the policeman as saviors and protectors. But if one could no longer hunt the manacora, one could still hunt the murderer. If the armed escort had grown less necessary, yet one still needed the analyst to frustrate the wiles of the poisoner. From this point of view, the detective steps into his right place as the protector of the weak, the latest of the popular heroes, the true successor of Roland and Lancelot. And she's just awesome, but I just really like that paragraph. I think it really sums up nicely sort of all of these different sort of conditions that are in place here before the first detective story is published, which is Edgar Allan Poe's 1841 story, Murders in the Rue Morgue. So I thought we would take a break, not take a break, but have a little discussion session. We've got about 50 participants at this point. So as Larissa pointed out, if you could just identify yourself as interested in contributing to the conversation, and then I think, is that right, Larissa? You can sort of unmute them for them.
Yep. Yep. That's what we'll do.
Great. So I just have 3 questions to maybe get us started here. The first one is, what to you characterizes the detective as a literary figure? The second question is, what to you distinguishes the police from the private detective or the private investigator? And this is, of course, such a huge sort of, sort of dynamic, I guess you could say, in the literature. And for the writers out there, what types of settings or information do you or could you use in crafting either type of character? The other night I was watching the Casey Affleck movie, Gone Baby Gone, and my brain was just spinning with all these different sort of things that the private investigator sort of has access to that the official police force doesn't. And the third question would be, how do detectives differ from one another? What do you see, for instance, as certain differences between men and women detectives that you've read or that you're a fan of? And what if we broaden our lens to consider detective fiction outside of the United States and England? What characterizes those detectives? And I thought maybe these 3 questions or any other that you'd like to chat about, I think we can start that conversation.
Hi. I have a comment about number 2, at least a little bit of it. By the way, I'm from a little farther east in Illinois, near Durand. I think one of the key things that distinguishes police from private detectives or other kinds of investigators is, in large part, the constraints that they operate under. Illinois just tried to change some of those. I'm not sure if the police reform bill is going to stay as it is, but I mean, traditionally, certainly police have rules that they have to follow, like Mirandizing potential, suspects and whatnot. They also have access to a lot more types of equipment, that they can use. One of the places that I've really enjoyed visiting in the last couple of years is called the Writers Police Academy, and
Oh, cool.
it's put on by current and former law enforcement people, from local police and sheriff's offices to ATF and FBI, CIA, and they have described a lot of the new techniques that they can use to track down evidence. And, like the new, I got to do a luminol test myself at one of them, but we also got to hear more updates. But police have both constraints and equipment that, I think most private eyes or casual, what we'd call amateur sleuths don't have.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And that's. I think you're absolutely right, Sharon. And I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts in terms of what does, if the police have more resources, let's say, What does the private eye or the private investigator sort of need to rely on instead of those resources? I wonder if anybody else wants to chime in on something like that as they're thinking about their own characters or characters that they like to read.
Going to unmute EB here. They had a comment.
Great.
Okay, well, I'll read it out loud then. Comment here. Okay. For the second question, I would say that police are very strongly expected to follow the law, while private investigators can be more morally gray and mysterious. And in some cases, they openly break the law in order to catch the criminal, which is somewhat hypocritical.
Mm.
On top of that, police are a group, while investigators tend to work solo, in pairs, making them seem more vulnerable and human at threat from the criminal, rather than a broad organizational structure with no real face or name.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, right? That morally gray area that the private investigator sort of navigates. And it, it's a plus minus, right? It's cost benefit. I mean, it gives them access to, maybe the inner circles of certain sort of local crime rings, if you will. There's a certain regional aspect to the private investigator too, sometimes, where they sort of know a little bit more on the inside, right, than the official police officers who are sort of kept obviously at a distance. That's a great observation. Any other thoughts about what about, say, the difference between men and women as detectives? Any thoughts out there regarding how these two types of detectives differ along the lines of gender?
I don't have anything in the comments about that specific.
Okay, no problem. I'm used to. Oh, Vicky, did you have something? I'm sorry, I thought I saw you. No. Okay, I just see you on the side here. No, it's fine. I'm used to the awkward silences. We'll have an opportunity at the end. We'll carve out a lot of space at the end for some more.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of comments in here about other things. Can you see the chat window, or would you like me to read them?
Oh no, here. Let me open up the chat window. Yeah, sure, Shelley. That would be great. I mean, I'm just sort of scrolling through. If you want to chime in about, yes, Spanish crime fiction, that sort of international dimension to it. Yeah, I think we'd love to hear it. I'm super interested in something like that.
Hi guys, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you pretty good now, yep.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so hi Steve.
Hi.
Steve and I have been in contact by email. My name, as you can see, is Shelley Godsland, and I'm the professor of Spanish at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. But at the minute I'm speaking to you from my home in Liverpool in the UK. So it's I'm quite far away from where you guys are. And as I say, I'm the professor of Spanish, and my research area is crime fiction. So what we see in Spain is that crime fiction doesn't really take off or detective fiction in Spain until the 1970s, 1980s,
Wow.
once Franco, the dictator, has died. And we then find that there's a copy of the American hard-boiled novel from the 1930s and 40s, and that's copied pretty much wholesale in Spain in the 1970s and 1980s, because the prevailing socioeconomic conditions are very similar, in fact, to those in the United States in the 30s and 40s. We then see that the detective, the police detective, starts to appear in the late 80s, early 1990s, because of course until that time, the police are still seen as the guard dogs and the guardians of the Franco regime, as a force that colluded with the ferocious repression of the Franco regime. So the Spanish aren't really going to start reading novels about the police until some time has passed since the death of the dictator. And I think I've got a couple of colleagues of mine who are down in Bowling Green in Kentucky and who work at the university there. So they may come in on this in a minute, Inma and Melissa. But a couple of things I would say about Spanish detective fiction at the moment. Two things. One is that there's still this very Spanish obsession with food. So you find that the detective investigation is going ahead. It's either a private detective or it's a police detective, but they have to keep stopping their investigation to eat and drink. And for anybody who's been in Europe, and particularly in Spain, you know that eating and drinking is a really, really very important part of daily life and daily activity. So they do a bit of investigation and they stop to eat and drink for longer than they actually carried out the investigation. So it's a very, very slow process. And the other thing that we see very much in Spain, and also to a certain extent in Latin America, and I would say very particularly in Argentina, is this return to the past. So the detective, the private detective or the police detective, is investigating a crime that's set very often in the present, in the 20th or the 21st century, but the key to the events that are being investigated lies very deep in the past, in the dictatorship in Spain from the 1930s to the 1970s, or even before that in the Civil War, which was 1936 to 39. So for me, those are two key aspects. And another key thing, we're talking also about women here, loads and loads of women detectives, private eyes, police detectives, cleaning ladies, librarians, academics, professors, anybody whose work allows them to get into somebody else's private space and snoop around. That's where all those Spanish women are investigating. And there's all sorts of different investigators, as I say. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shelley. No, thank you very much. Okay, terrific. Yeah, and like I said, we have time at the end here too that we can return if somebody still sort of thinking through some stuff. We'll have time to return to all of this. Very good. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think what we can do now is we can turn to different kinds of detectives or different kinds of detection. And the three I want to talk about, or the three we'll talk about today, is Edgar Allan Poe's sort of idea of this, and I think I'm pronouncing this right, ratiocination is the word that he uses in his detective fiction, which really kind of launches the genre. And like I said, it's 1841 when Poe first publishes Murders in the Rue Morgue. And I mean, lots of sort of characteristics of the genre come out of those stories. So I thought we could talk a little bit about those. And I saw in the comments ideas about intuition, right? And that becomes such a key component of detectives. So this idea of ratiocination, I understand it as this kind of conflation or this combination of rational and imagination, right? That the detective sort of needs both. They need that sort of rational thought, but they also need that imagination, or maybe the word is intuition. They need that sort of gut response as well to help them solve mysteries. Okay, Poe's detective is a man named Auguste Dupin, and he, like I said, it's considered the really the first sort of official, I guess, detective story. Although, again, you can read all different kinds of origins of where some even say Oedipus Rex, right, from Sophocles' Oedipus the King, in some ways sort of exhibits, detective-ish traits as he slowly uncovers the mystery of the Plague of Thieves. But Poe creates something of a template for detectives to come, including Holmes, right? Including Sherlock Holmes. So what does that template look like? A few things. It's that rational intellect fused with ingenuity or creative thinking. That person is oftentimes an eccentric. And if you think about the actual definition of eccentric, it means without center. So someone like Holmes, brilliant in some ways and completely awkward and unable to function in others, right? That sort of lack of that kind of, social understanding really characterizes Holmes, usually eccentric. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is this narration through the lens of an assistant, right? Watson is the person who narrates the Holmes stories. In Edgar Allan Poe's work, it is his assistant, his unnamed assistant, who narrates. And what does that allow us to do? Well, it prompts in them, the Watsons and the assistants of the world, that ability to just sort of observe and just, become enamored, if you will, or sort of in awe, maybe is the better way of saying it, in awe of this kind of dazzling intellect, right? Dorothy Sayers' word is bedazzlement. We witness their intellectual feats and we sort of become aligned with the Watsons of the world as we see what the Holmeses of the world can do. So if we take a look at a couple of passages just from a couple Holmes stories, and I see that the chat is still going, but I don't have it like open. So if I need to stop, please just let me know. So here's a passage from The Man with the Twisted Lip. This is Watson. Sherlock Holmes was a man, however, who, when he had an unsolved problem upon his mind, would go for days and even for a week without rest, turning it over, rearranging his facts, looking at it from every point of view until he had either fathomed it or convinced himself that his data were insufficient. In another story, the more anthologized story, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, that's the one that sort of gets anthologized the most. Holmes says to Watson at the end, I had, said he, come to an entirely erroneous conclusion, which shows, my dear Watson, how dangerous it always is to reason from insufficient data. And I think it's interesting that, both passages highlight this, let me just kind of underline it here, this phrase, insufficient data, right? Definitely speaking to the sort of rational element of Holmes's detection. But it also requires that intuition, that ability to sort of think differently than everybody else can think, that also characterizes Holmes and detectives like Holmes. For those of you who are interested in literary terminology, the second passage, right after that, Holmes then explains how he arrived at the conclusion that he arrived at to solve the case. And this is, in literary terminology, something called the analepsis, which is basically the literary term for what we see in all kinds of detective fiction at the end, which is that flashback that explains the sequence of events and the observations that led to the discovery. Agatha Christie's, for instance, And Then There Were None, ends with, you know, the letter in the bottle, right? And that letter sort of describes how all of this stuff plays out, right? That would be a classic example of an analepsis. So if you're interested in sort of literary terminology, there's one for you, okay? The second kind of detective is and Shelley had mentioned this just a couple minutes ago, is the hard-boiled detective. And this is the one that, I don't know, I suppose is probably the one that has taken hold quite a bit of at least the American imagination in terms of detectives, more than, you know, a figure like Holmes, although, you know, there's still all kinds of work, you know, films and, you know, adaptations of Holmes out there. But the hard-boiled really sort of has cemented itself, I guess, into the popular imagination. And when we say hard-boiled, we mean, you know, rough and tough. These detectives, and they're often private investigators, right? They're sort of off the grid, so to speak. They've been made cynical. Philip Marlowe, you know, kind of detectives, right? Through a world of corruption and violence. Their tough exterior, though, often covers an inner sort of moral code, a commitment to justice. It's a little slippery because there's a lot of misogyny going on in Hard-Boiled. A lot of slapping women, for instance. But before writing those novels, Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, published in pulp magazines. And I've provided some you know, examples, some covers of detective pulp magazines, and they were called pulp magazines because they were made of pulp wood. The paper was made of cheap material, and that allowed for a lot of different things. They could be made cheap, right? Obviously, they could be shipped in mass, and they could sort of be read quickly, and, you know, kind of without a whole, you know, financial commitment on the part of the reader. And these are all fiction magazines. There's all kinds of great stuff out there on pulp magazines. And again, I invite anyone who's a sort of pulp magazine fan to chime in on what we're seeing in some of these magazines. But if you ever wanted a great website to just sort of look around at, I would really strongly encourage you to take a look at pulpmags.org. It's open access. That's where I got these covers. There's full text of pulp magazines. There's a list of, recommended reading, further reading into it, and so on and so forth. So you get a lot of the hard-boiled really is the sort of the rough and tough kind of private eye, the private investigator. Yeah, go ahead. Somebody unmute. Yep. Whoops, sorry. Okay, yeah, so the hard-boiled is another sort of class of detectives. And here's a couple passages that I think, we can, again, take a look at. And this is Marlowe from Chandler's The Big Sleep. And teaching that book can be a little bit of a challenge. It's a complicated plot, but it's a fun one. And once you kind of crack the code of how to read Chandler, I think students really, for you teachers out there, students can really get into that kind of hard-boiled mode. It was a crisp morning with just enough snap in the air to make life seem simple and sweet if you didn't have too much on your mind. I had too much on my mind. And I oftentimes tell my students that seems is a great word for literature. Not necessarily a great word for writing about literature, for making arguments about literature, but it's a great word in literature because it gives us that great sense of ambiguity, right? That Marlowe, as he's sort of waking up to that kind of crisp Los Angeles morning, you're tricked into thinking that life is simple and sweet. It makes it seem like it. But of course, that cynical side of Marlowe is going to say, quickly subvert that sort of sweet simplicity, right? And sort of say that there's too much cooking here, that the world is too messed up for it to just actually be simple and sweet, and that all it can really ever do is just seem simple and sweet. Really interesting. The second one comes from a later novel, late 70s, I think, McIlvaney's Laidlaw, where Laidlaw says, this is in reference to murder, really a sort of philosophical almost sort of way of thinking about things. He says, they're using a language, Laidlaw said. Your way of life is taught to you like a language. It's how you express yourself, but any language conceals as much as it reveals. And there's a lot of languages, all of them human. This murder is a very human message, but it's in code. We have to try and crack the code. But what we're looking for is a part of us. You don't know that, you can't begin. And this, I think, a passage like this, if we're thinking about like the practice, if you will, of detective fiction, I think a passage like this really speaks to, all these influences that we've been talking about. The first, in relation to Chandler's passage, is that idea of things concealed, right? Here, let me get my pen going here. That language conceals as much as it reveals. And if we look up here, we see something similar, right? That LA is giving us something, right? This makes it seem simple and sweet, but is also keeping something hidden, right? And I think Laidlaw is saying something similar, that language conceals just as much as it reveals. And that what we have to do, or what the detective has to do, and us, right? We'll talk about that. But what the detective has to do is he has to try to crack that code, just as we are trying to sort of crack that code as we read detective fiction. And he, Laidlaw makes something really, says something really interesting. But what we're looking for is a part of us. And McIlvaney is a Scottish writer, and Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish writer. And I think we had mentioned earlier that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde phenomenon, right? That idea that the criminal and the detective might not be as far apart as we want to think they are. And I think Laidlaw really, highlights that when he says, but what we're looking for is a part of us. I mean, if that doesn't come directly out of Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I don't know what does. So these are just kind of two instances of, hard-boiled / noir-ish detective writing, and what these detective writers are trying to do with character. And I think, hopefully those two passages, shed some light on that. The third kind of detective, and this one's been on my mind this past week, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes, but the third kind of detective is what we would call the police procedural. And we heard from Sharon earlier, who had talked about that difference between the private investigator and the police force, and how the police force has to deal with, certain, bureaucratic structures and hindrances and things that hold them up. And that's really what the police procedural is all about. And when I first taught this class, I didn't have the language. I just called them cop dramas, you know. I just thought back to my childhood and, you know, what my mom liked to watch. I think like Hill Street Blues and all these kinds of shows. And and you think to like, you know, the 80s Magnum PI and people like this, right? And I didn't really have the language. I just always thought they were just called cop dramas or something like that. But really what you're looking at when you're watching those kinds of shows, Law and Order, Hill Street Blues, what you're looking at is what's called the police procedural. And these two pages come out of Ed McBain's Cop Hater, and again, real kind of classic in the police procedural world. But I think it's really interesting because what it does is it showcases some of that bureaucracy, right? Some of those official documentation, official documents that police have to rely on in order to solve the case within the sort of rigors or the confines of their, you know, institutional profession, right? And these are actually, you know, McBain actually puts these into the body of his novel. So you get forms, for instance, that, you know, highlight the precinct and the names and the name of the prisoner and, you know, so on and so forth, and single and employed and all this kind of, you know, just, you know, formal, I guess, you know, forms that need to be filled out. And then you get kind of descriptions of the bullets, right? Remington bullet taken from wooden booth behind body of Michael Reardon. So the procedural does a couple of things. It highlights the sort of institution of police work, right? It works from within the professional world of police work. And it also relies on that certain kind of sense of realism, if you will, right? That there's a sort of gritty, I guess you could say, realism to the genre. And this is a student favorite, this novel, Cop Hater. I said it was on my mind because I just finished last night watching the new Netflix series, Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. And it's about Richard Ramirez in the 80s. It is quite graphic. I think it's good, but it's very graphic. But it's totally police procedural. In its emphasis, it's about those detectives who work for the LAPD. It's about those detectives in their hunt for the serial killer. And so much of the show is focused on footprints and bullet casings and fingerprints and where they kind of hit, you know, bureaucratic restrictions and where they're able to go and when they're able to go and when they can't, and all this kind of politics around the hunt for a serial killer. And these are actually the thumbnails from Netflix that they use. It's just a 4-episode series, but these are the thumbnails that they use. And I think you can sort of see, even in these, a classic feel for the detective and the imagery associated with it, both in the terms of police procedurals, right? The yellow tape and the, you know, footprints and the pictures, etc. But also a really sort of classic, even this sort of feels kind of hard-boiled, doesn't it? The sort of flashlights of the car as it drives down the dark alley streetways of Los Angeles in the middle of the 1980s. So all of this and plenty more, right, brings us to the appeal of detective fiction. And by that, I mean the reasons why we read it. It's a fascinating genre in the sense that there's just a lot of it, right? And people who read a lot of detective fiction they read a lot of detective fiction, and there's it. And when we see television shows and movies, they're just so often based around this kind of pursuit of crime. And I guess the really basic question here is why? You know, what is the appeal, and why do we read so much of it? Why do we love the literature and the films and the shows that feature detectives and mysteries? And you know, I'll open my chat now, but I'd love to hear if anyone, you know, wants to chime in. Just note, you know, tell Larissa to do so, or I think we could unmute too, whatever you want to do. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in terms of why you like it. Why do you like to write it? Why do you like to read it? Love to hear those thoughts.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, hi. My name's Ayo Onotade, and I'm a crime fiction reviewer and blogger here in the UK. I'm actually in Kent at the moment, and one of the reasons why I read crime fiction, and I've been reading it for 40 plus years, is that it gives you a good grounding in social history and social commentary. And I always say that to people, that if you want to have a good grounding in social commentary or social history, what's going on, and I can use Mark Billingham, one of Mark Billingham's books, for an example, and I'm afraid the title has escaped me, but it's about homelessness. I would say read a crime novel.
Yeah.
Because it goes into so much detail, and you understand what's going on around you, and it is just also so fascinating.
No, that's an awesome point. The sort of social commentary that's built into these works that are really, you know, in essence, are coming directly out of sort of our living world, right? That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There are quite a few comments in the chat.
Yeah, I'm reading through. And if anyone, I know I'm sort of staring at the screen here. If anyone wants to chime in and sort of verbalize, you know, their observations on the chat, feel free. But you know, that's okay if not. Larissa, do you mind if I read? I guess I can read a couple.
Sure, you can read them if you'd like. Or...
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, and maybe I can, you know, oh boy, yeah, they're really rolling in here. So, what was the one I was just looking at? Yeah, Aaron writes, humankind is always questioning the dark side. We like to read it and comfort ourselves by saying we could never be capable of such darkness. I think that's a really great observation. And I think to the earlier speaker's point as well, that you know, it's kind of that classic idea of you know, how the other half lives, so to speak, giving us that access into places or areas of look, the real world that many of us just don't really have access, you know, don't see on a daily basis. And it sort of brings our awareness to, you know, social consciousness, if you will. And that sort of flirting with the dark side. I think that's why Jekyll and Hyde is such a great sort of text, if you will, or something like that, because it is so much about that. Well, who's, you know, where does the darkness end and the light begin, or something like that, right? If you ever see the HBO show The Wire, for instance, this is another kind of classic procedural show that is always trying to juxtapose just how far the sort of good guys are from the bad, right? Quote unquote. So I think that is a great observation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do we have any participants that might like to unmute themselves and kind of expand on what they've typed here in the chat? Go ahead if you do.
I do.
Great.
My daughter is a homicide detective, and she has a lot of interesting stories, and she does have, you know, she has to follow the rules, and she does have police restraints. But what an interesting job.
Yeah, really. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, Bernadette's point is, you know, well taken. I mean, you know, what an interesting job. Teaching at a small liberal arts university in the upper Midwest, I can say that one of the most popular majors for undergraduate students is still psychology. And I think to a large degree, they're really sort of interested in psychology because they're interested in sort of criminal psychology, right? They're interested in sort of how the mind works. And you oftentimes hear things about getting into the mind of the killer and having to sort of take on the psychology of the killer in order to, you know, solve the case, so on and so forth. There's a real lure, a real appeal for students into that sort of world of psychology, abnormal psychology, whatever we want to, you know, whatever sort of their particular interests are. But yeah, I mean, Bernadette as well, that's right. Your daughter's got, sounds like a really cool, interesting, maybe not cool, but interesting job.
Okay, Shelley has a question.
Sure.
Yeah, hi there. I hope you can hear me. I put there in the chat an observation about reading crime fiction as a means of bringing back to life the victim of a murder. And I do feel that as a reader myself of vast quantities, perhaps not necessarily literary crime fiction, but crime fiction that I'm for pleasure, for enjoyment, I find that I read a lot of male writers. I find that I read a lot about murders of you know, female victims, and with the narrative is a minute reconstitution of the life of the woman who's been murdered. I wonder if any other participants in the workshop today have that feeling of sort of identification as a human being with the victim in a crime fiction, that need of some sort of assurance or reassurance as a human being that after we are gone, somebody will engage some sort of process of bringing us back to life. And I also, the question I wanted to ask you, Steve, more than anything was, do you happen to know if during this dreadful pandemic, there's a greater consumption of crime fiction, detective fiction on screen, on television or Netflix or other streaming services, or in literary print format? And if you think that perhaps the current situation we're living with so much death and so much uncertainty may be perhaps prompting us to consume more fiction of this sort. Yeah, that was my question. Thanks a lot, and my observation.
Yeah, that's a great question, Shelley. I mean, I don't know a specific answer to that, but I could, if detective fiction, and many of you have said something like that in the chat, if it is that sort of reaffirmation of social order, right? And we hear this a lot when we talk about detective fiction, that crime sort of creates a sort of rip in that social fabric, and the detective, or that sort of process of investigation sort of, you know, stitches that rip up, at least, you know, until the next rip happens. But if it gives us that sense of as Anu writes here, very satisfying, everything is neatly tied up, then it is a genre that is interested in sort of reaffirming a sense of order and maybe security, as someone posted in the chat group, reaffirms the ideological status quo. And maybe that is a genre that we turn to in moments like this in particular, during a pandemic, that gives us some sense of, normalcy is not the word, but some sense of things getting tidied up and resolution, winning the day, if you will. The other point is, Shelley's other point is super interesting as well, this kind of reconstruction of history. Because history and detective fiction can be deep pasts, like in the Gothic, for instance, that kind of, that preceding genre, if you will, the influencing genre of the Gothic. Oftentimes that history is deep. It's a medieval history. And the Gothic was doing something very similar to detective fiction in terms of establishing status quo, right? That it was sort of saying, like, look at all that weird medieval history, right? That stuff is bonkers. So even though it addressed that kind of supernatural darkness, weirdness, it ultimately was there to sort of say that stuff was sort of deep, deep past. And detective fiction, in terms of reconstructing a past, that's interesting if other participants think along Shelley's lines that it gives us a sense that we will be somehow ourselves reconstructed and remembered, if you will, after our own death and in the face of our own mortality. Yeah, I'd love to hear thoughts on that question. That's a great one. I wish I came up with that one.
Well, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Yeah, I have a question actually. Well, can we say, I was going to talk about Oedipus, but you already mentioned Oedipus. But can we say Hamlet might be an inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe? Because Hamlet fits the bill. I mean, it has a murder, it has a mystery, and he gets the answer right from the start, from the roast. But he even questions the roast. He says, are you a good spirit or a bad spirit?
Yeah.
And he has this sidekick, Horatio. He is hard-boiled, he's abusive towards women, and he kind of follows this police work. He puts on display in order to catch his uncle. He tries to, he questions everyone, and he's eccentric, he doesn't fit the bill, and he's kind of out of bounds, and the real criminal actually tries to get rid of him, tries to get him killed. So maybe we might say Hamlet is like a proto-detective, maybe.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Sirkin, did I pronounce that correctly? Sirkin, yeah. That's a great observation. Sure. I mean, that scene, I think you make a really strong case there for sort of Hamlet's influence on Poe. Anybody else want to add to that idea of Hamlet as I'd mentioned Oedipus. Anyone else want to mention Hamlet a little bit further down the road and how Hamlet might sort of factor into that original archetype of the detective? That's a really interesting observation.
Thank you.
One of the things I was thinking as you were talking, in the sort of the classic, I was thinking about other Shakespeare too, and in terms of that earlier discussion way at the beginning of the presentation about providence and providential sort of deliverance and discovery, what have you, even in something like Twelfth Night, if you remember Viola's ring, if you've ever read Twelfth Night, you remember Viola's ring soliloquy. She's gotten herself into this love triangle based, via cross-dressing. It's a wild ride of a comedy. But at the end of it, she says, you know, time, right? Time needs to untie this knot. And she says, I can't do it, you know, and I wonder if there's, you know, maybe Sirkin, there's a book to be written about Shakespeare's sort of detective sort of impulses, but that idea that Viola, in that instance, and Viola in her at the end of her ring soliloquy, that she just sort of says, like, listen, I'm not going to be able to unravel this thing. We are all bound up in some wild sort of complex knot, and it's really going to be up to time to unravel it. And you know, I think to some degree, and maybe this speaks then also to Shelley's point about reconstruction, that the process of reading too is somehow related. You know, somehow related to time, the passage of time as the clues reveal themselves, as the mystery begins to unravel. I'll be honest with you, I haven't done much thinking on those kinds of questions, but I could totally see Shakespeare's influence in the rise of detective fiction, for sure, in lots of different ways, I guess, if we sit and think about it a little bit. Wuthering Heights, Dr. Faustus, Hamlet, the Gothic, yep. Maybe we could, this might be a good question for the audience here. What elements of the, and again, I'm just going to use your questions because these are good ones, these are better than mine. What elements of the plot story do we miss when we watch a film version rather than read a novel? What are things that we miss? And then maybe we can turn to Katie's question too that just popped up. That's a good one as well. But does anyone have any thoughts about what we miss when detective fiction turns into detective film? Internal thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. For sure, the inner. Mm-hmm. Yep. Character changes, inner dialogue. It's really fascinating. I don't know. I just find this stuff endlessly fascinating when you think about sort of representations of detectives in crime, like we were looking at earlier with the case of Guy Fawkes versus narrative, and what the narrative affords that other, you know, visual representations don't. That kind of question of the investigation is what I was talking about. But you're right. The sort of character change, inner dialogue, more of a passive experience when we watch versus when we read. The lack of participation in the investigation, absolutely. Mm-hmm. It is, I agree, Anna. It is difficult, it seems, when I watch these movies. It's difficult to put any kind of emphasis on clues without, you know, sort of blowing it, if you will. I want you to never judge a book by its movie. Right. Ambiguous portrait. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Richer sort of character development. Terrific. Yeah, fantastic. Maybe we could, I'm just kind of checking that, whoops. There was this one question that popped up, and I thought maybe we could ask it of the group. So Katie asks, what's the biggest change you've noticed in detective fiction in the last century? Again, you know, I really, you know, thought about this as a sort of workshop. So I'd love to hear what changes have you noticed in detective fiction in the last century? Yeah, for sure. Gritty, violence. Yeah.
Sharon, if you'd like to say your comment out loud, you can go ahead and unmute and do that.
Yeah, one of the things I think I've noticed is a lot more diversity among crime fiction authors, or at least more publication of diverse authors. One of my new favorite people is Tracy Clark. She's from Chicago, and she has a new series about a former Chicago police detective who turns PI, sort of along the lines of Sue Grafton's Casey Milhone, and sort of along the lines of V.R. Warshawski, who is Sarah Paretsky's detective. But the difference is Tracy is herself Black, her detective is Black, and the stories are set more on the south side of Chicago. But I've read her first 3 books in the series, and I think they're great fun. But I've also, there are others who are, different men that I've read who are and women of color. I think there's more voices out there than there were early in the century. That's just, and I've enjoyed it because, I'm just this old white lady from a little town in northern Illinois, and I don't get out that much. So it's really fun to me to see all these different perspectives. That's pretty much it.
No, yeah, that's great. I mean, yeah, that's for sure. Representation amongst detective fiction, I think, has grown. I mean, it was so predominantly, I mean, one of the things about Holmes that's interesting is that, when you create such a sort of cultural force like Sherlock Holmes, right, where it's kind of like you don't even have to read Sherlock Holmes to know Sherlock Holmes, that really sort of creates that sort of wall at which you can, and Shelley pointed out, all the, the librarians and all the professor detectives, et cetera. It really creates that sort of central figure that all these writers can sort of respond to by creating all these different new forms of detectives. And, I guess sadly, but not surprisingly, the representation, has taken a long time, at least in the United States. So that's a great point to bring up, Sharon. There's also this kind of new stuff with like like neo-noir, like new noir, where the kind of dark, gritty landscape of, I don't know, or cityscape of, a place like Los Angeles, it's not really characterized by necessarily down and out, but it's more like environment, like an environmental sort of shift, right? That it'll be interesting to see how, and maybe they're already out there, but interesting to see sort of detective writers maybe putting their characters into landscapes that have been drastically changed by climate, right? By climate changes. That would be another interesting way to sort of, remap the detective and the investigation of a mystery into a different sort of space, to the point about the, sort of social awareness. Rural crime, yeah, rural crime, right? That's great too. I mean, the first season of True Crime, takes place in that kind of deep South, the sort of rural crime deep South. And then the second season sort of picks up with the classic LA noir, super complicated plot. Nobody liked season 2, at least things I read. But yeah, True Detective is maybe great for that kind of rural, and maybe that is a return to Miss Marple, that kind of rural, and in the United States, that sort of Southern Gothicness of it all, of kind of Louisiana and those kinds of places. Good. Steampunk detective, that's cool. Yeah, I don't know enough about that. Great. Awesome. Well, so yeah, I mean, I think to sort of wrap up, and it's a little early, but I think to wrap up, I think what we could, really think about in terms of the appeal of detective fiction. On the one hand, I agree with Dorothy Sayers that detective fiction gives us that puzzle, that, gives us that thing that we can answer and solve, that we like puzzles. We like all kinds of puzzles. And it gives us that sort of certain assurance, if you will, in a very uncertain world or universe. And I think that's a real draw. It will. Yes. Sorry, I cut myself off here. Yes, I will definitely make my works cited available, and I'll make a comment about that when we wrap up for sure. Thanks, Sharon. So that's one aspect of it. Is that there's also lots of philosophical aspects of it in regards to reconstruction, right? Putting the pieces back together. This is oftentimes in the early 20th century called that kind of fair play, that the writer has to provide the clues to allow the reader at least the chance to solve it, right? That fair play. I'm never very good at it. I'm always just usually along for the ride. But there is also that sort of bigger sense of not just the puzzle, but also that reaffirmation that we talked a little bit about, that many of you talked about, that sort of return to a sense of stability, right? That the crime breaks it. And again, that Netflix series, that most recent one, Night Stalker, does a great job of sort of really giving that ethos of anxiety in Los Angeles County in the middle of the 80s there. I mean, you feel it. That sort of gives us that reassurance that we've kind of come out of the darkness, so to speak, and solved the mystery. But again, at the same time, it's really, to me, I always just think back to Jekyll and Hyde, that it's always that sort of duality in the human spirit, and where one ends and where the other one begins, right? The light and the dark. I mean, it's really kind of literary analysis 101, but it's really interesting stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of the commandments of crime fiction, right? I think, Chandler in the simple the simple art of murder, right? The essay he wrote about classic detective fiction, and that sort of adherence to the commandments of crime fiction. He sort of takes issue with that, and I think T.S. Eliot writes something about the commandments of detective fiction as well. So either way, I think, I hope you enjoyed this workshop, this presentation. I love the conversation. I've got lots of, I hope we can save this group chat. I don't know if we can, but there's all kinds of great stuff here. I'm happy to share this entire PowerPoint with you if you'd like. And I'll be sure, if you just reach out to me directly, I'll be happy to provide you my bibliography, my works cited. My email address is just steve.bellamy. That's Bellomy. It's the sort of old, it's the English spelling of Bellamy. Usually in the States, it's with an A or an E. But it's Steve Bellamy, Bellomy, at clark.edu, and Clark is with an E. I'll share the PowerPoint if you'd like, or just the bibliography if you'd like that as well. Both, whatever you'd like. I hope you enjoyed the event, and I wish you all health and wellness during these unprecedented times. If you have any other questions, again, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.